How can we say things? How can we use our voices for good? Good morning and welcome to the very first episode of 2024 of Recipe for Success. I can hardly believe this is actually my fourth season of doing it. So this is very exciting, and I could not be happier to kick it off with my very special guest today. So today I have Rose Fass, who's not only a two-time best-selling author, but she's also the founder and chair of Fast Forward Consulting Group, which is a prominent business transformation boutique. So Rose, let's kick it off by introducing yourself to the audience and telling them a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Rose. I spent a good part of 30 plus years in corporate, and was in the C-suite for a little while and ended up over in, after spending about 23 years in a Fortune 15 company, I ended up going over to Gartner, where I met a young engineer. And it was at that time that I had kind of an itch to start my own firm and to think about what we would do next. My last assignment was a chief transformation officer, and it was in the 90s. And we couldn't even spell the word transformation. And I had no idea. Ann Mulcahy was the CEO of Xerox at that time. And I had started my career at Xerox when it was $1,000 a share. And Ann was a fabulous CEO, and she had asked me to come in and do this job as the CTO. And so I did. And I went to that job kind of kicking and screaming, and it became the genesis for Fast Forward Consulting Group. So Gavin McMahon joined me in 2001. And 22 years later, we are working with Fortune 15 to Fortune 500 companies and helping them with their transformations.
Well, let's talk about transformation a little bit, because I think we all know what the word means, but in practical aspect, if a company comes to you and says, we need help transforming ourselves, what does that mean? How do you get involved? And how do you measure transformation results?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because like every word that ever gets used, whether in corporate or in our genre, they get overused, misused, and then ultimately they lose their meaning.
Correct.
So for us, transformation does not mean what everyone thinks it means, change management. Change management is something that every consulting group works on, and it can be process-driven, technology-driven, all of that. I look at transformation as every company has a DNA, and the chances of that company completely changing that DNA are not very good. So we kind of break it up, and this is a Roseism. It's transitioning from your existing form, transform, to take a new action. Transformation. And I look at it as, what do you want to transform? Most companies want to figure out, we've had an old business model, it's not working anymore. We'd like to bring in a new strategy, or we'd like to figure out a new way of presenting what it is we've been good at. So for example, IBM years ago was a big iron company, and they wanted to become a software company. We don't deal with the change from the big iron to the software. We deal with, how do the people go there? How does the business model change? What is it that you need to do differently to drive that change through the company in a way that it's going to be a successful change? So it usually starts at the very beginning, understanding what is the purpose of the company. Has that changed? And with IBM, it was never any different. It was, you do business with IBM, you're probably going to be okay. It was like an insurance company.
Right.
Secondly, it's, what's the purpose behind what you stand for, and can people sign up for that? Particularly your customers, because today customers are purpose driven. They want to be involved in brands that make sense to them, ethos wise as well as brand wise. So that's another thing. And then we look at mission, values, and goals, and then we try to get that all aligned. We often say we're in the McKinsey, Bain, Boston Consulting Group aftermarket because we don't come in with the big, huge strategy. We come in with the translation of that to what's the simple few initiatives you can act on that will drive significant change in the company, but not lose your DNA, keep your culture, figure all of that out. So as a business transformation firm, we work in 3 areas. We work on your leaders. How are they leading? We work on storytelling. What's the narrative in the company? And how do people translate complex concepts into stories people can relate to? And then we work in the area of customer experience in a way that your customers experience you the way you want them to. So we do coaching, we do training, and we do consulting.
So, do you ever have a client come to you for a transformation project? And when you get into it a little bit with them, you find that they're not actually ready to make a transformation, or they have you ever run into that type of issue? Because sometimes people say they want something, but deep down, they're not willing to take the actions necessary to make it happen.
Yeah, of course. And usually they're not ready for it because they have to make certain changes in the way they are behaving, driving the culture. It's usually the soft stuff that affects it. So, for example, a lot of companies want to grow. And so very often their strategy for growth is to acquire other companies. They don't often think about that acquisition in terms of, is that company not just strategically good for us, but does the talent and the culture click with our talent and culture? And very often we refer to this as a DNA sequence. You buy a company for either their customer base, their revenue, or their strategy, but you're not really crazy about their people and you don't really love their culture. And that causes companies to fail. I've written about this in both books. It's been one of the personal disappointments that a lot of people have had who are being acquired and brought into a larger company, and they kind of feel like they've lost their recipe for success.
Yeah, I can understand that. Okay, well, let's talk about your books for a second. So the first one was called The Chocolate Conversation. I know there's a little bit more to that, but such an interesting and, shall we say, tempting name for a book. Tell me what prompted you to write the book, and then how did you come up with this name?
So the name came first, the book came second. My last year at university, I got invited to a BYOC party, bring your own chocolate. And I thought that'll be a lot more fun than the booze, because
Sure.
I always felt like, those BOYBs, you're kind of holding a glass of whatever and you're trying to be cool and it's not quite working. So I figured, great, we all love chocolate. This will be a lot of fun. So I brought my killer chocolate cake. I thought I was going to be the hit of this party, and I got there and there was this very long table filled with every possible confection you could think of, and really unique and intricate stuff. And I realized as I placed my cake down, I was pretty much on the average side of what was being, displayed. But what was interesting to me is as we walked around and had conversations, we were all there for our love of chocolate, but there were some real chocolate snobs in the group. I had not experienced that before. And I was walking, and this gentleman was walking with me, and there was this very, very, very thin woman. And she looked like she'd never eaten any chocolate. Anyway, the guy said to me, God, did you think it was going to be that? I said, I really didn't. And he said, I want a chocolate, a Snickers bar would do it for me. And this woman turned around and said, oh no, if I'm going to eat chocolate, it has to have a certain percent of cacao. And I let it linger on my tongue. And by the time she got through, we were both looking at each other like, did we just land in Mars? Pun intended. I ended up years later at a all company meeting in Xerox, and we were promoting a new strategy, and we were senior leaders, and we all left that meeting with a very different interpretation of what we had heard. And that, for some stupid reason, Nancy, that chocolate party came back to me. And I said to myself, we're having a chocolate conversation. And it dawned on me that here we were, you know, we all had a common worldview around this strategy, but when we got to the standards for what it would be like to implement it, lots of concerns bubbled up. And by the time we got through, the CEO was deeply disappointed, brought us all back in, gave us this big lecture about we didn't really cascade this properly and all that. So fast forward the clock again, pun intended, I get into the new company and we're doing a big project for a very big financial firm. And they're explaining to me that they have a consulting group and then they have their, what they call business as usual group, which was not a great name.
Not a great name.
They were really phenomenal bankers who had very strong careers. They were subject matter experts, and the consultants were going to take what they knew to market in a different way. And I suggested to the president at that time that maybe we change the name from the consulting group, who were known as the Big Bid Opportunity Group, and the BAU group, to subject matter experts and practice leads. That little thing, that little language thing, really did go far to stop the chocolate conversation. So very long story short, we end up in our first workshop. And I throw something out I've never done before. And I said, if I say the word chocolate, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? And one person says, Haagen-Dazs. Another person says, the studio and the gym. Another person says, my golden retriever. I even had one crazy guy in the room that says Holly Berry. And I'm like sitting there going, I can't believe this is corporate. But what I said to them, isn't it interesting? A simple word like chocolate, and it conjures up so many different images. From a worldview standpoint, when I said chocolate, you had no hesitation. You understood it. But your standards were all different. You wanted Haagen-Dazs. You wanted a certain Brazilian chocolate. You wanted a golden, a chocolate laboratory retriever. So I said, when you think about strategy and you think about what you have been asked to do, how much more complex is that translation than the word chocolate? And then I came to the fact that there were 3 layers to a chocolate conversation: the worldview, the standard, and the concerns that got conjured up. I took it one step further and I thought about Stephen Jobs, and I said, you know, he never starts at the worldview level, his big idea. He always starts at, what is the concern that a customer has and how can I solve for it? You never knew you needed 1,000 songs in your pocket. And if you were going to get 1,000 songs in your pocket, you probably thought you were going to get it from Sony, the Walkman. But there was Stephen Jobs thinking about an unmet need in the market during a time when people needed entertainment. And he came up with this. Same thing with the iPod, same thing with the iPhone. He was not in the phone business. So I thought, isn't it interesting if we reverse things and we start out by explaining to people the unmet need we're trying to fill, the standard we're looking to do it with. That then begins to reframe people's worldviews rather than starting with a worldview. And you can sort of unpack the chocolate conversation by reversing the way you think about it. So I want to spend 2 seconds on this to say that people get it when you say there's a need in the world for remote technology. And all of a sudden, we are now in a pandemic, and it's not only a need, but it's essential. And there's a certain standard we want with it. We want people to look good. We want the sound to be good. We want the visuals to be able to connect each other. We want all of that. There's other standards. And then you reframe people's worldviews who never wanted to get on, and you can get a grandma now that's on Zoom, so excited to see the new child, because we've reframed the worldview. So I do believe that Jobs was capable, not that he was the best leader in the world, but he was capable of changing worldviews and standards on the world stage. And it all came from looking to solve for an unmet need. When we start at the worldview level, we give our point of view. And whenever you share a point of view, people want to share their point of view. We see it on the public stage all the time. And that's where the leadership conversation starts to break down, because people get very passionate about what their point of views are. And it often shuts down a conversation before you have the opportunity to open it up. But when you are vulnerable and you can talk about an unmet need, it invites a more generative conversation. So after I finished that gig at MasterCard, somebody said, "Have you ever written this down?" And several years later, I decided to write it down, and I wrote the book, Chocolate Conversation. Lead bittersweet change and transform your business.
That's amazing story. I love it. And I never thought about it the way you just described it, but I love it so much, because one of the things that I've always done a little bit differently in my industry is I try to talk to people instead of exhibiting my mastery of the employee benefits industry, because we talk in a different language than they talk in. And it's intimidating, and their brains shut down. And either A, they are not receptive to the new concept that's being presented, or they feel inadequate. And again, they don't want to continue because they don't know enough. And I take that all the way down to the employee level. If we're having a meeting for employees, I'll always start off with, I know this is you're probably nervous to be sitting here. You want to know what's changing, what's going to happen to your deductible. Can I still see my doctor? And so we start there and then work our way back up. And the adoption of that type of philosophy has been so much more successful, at least for me, to start at their concerns. And then
that's a beautiful example. That's a beautiful example of avoiding a chocolate conversation, unpacking it. That's because you went right for what would be the concern of those employees.
Right.
What are they going to, can I see the same? This first question they're asking. So when we give these lofty worldviews, people don't buy into that. They want to know, what are you doing about it? I mean, look at how long it's taken for the border crises that we're in right now to even be discussed as a problem.
Right.
Pretending it wasn't a problem, and having people wonder what you're doing about it, crime, all the things that we're coping with today on the world stage. It's just, people are not going to listen to these worldviews. They want to know what you're doing about their unmet needs, their concerns.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, so you got one best-selling book, and you think, well, hey, may as well write another one. What prompted you to write your second book?
It didn't happen like that, by the way.
Okay, well,
when
it seems like a good story.
Yeah, I love that. I wish it had. I was asked by my partners and my employees to write another book, and I was like, it's very painful when you have to sit down and put a book together. It's different than a blog or anything else. It takes a tremendous amount of time. You do it on weekends because you're working all during the week, and it's extremely laborious. But I decided that we needed to contemporize a lot of the concepts that were in the original Chocolate Conversation book, because that happened pre-pandemic. It happened when Barack Obama had just gotten presidency, and it was quite wonderful, and had a real opportunity to talk about a lot of things. I talked a lot about Steve Jobs in that book. So I needed to bring in new stories, updates. And we had also kind of grown our methodologies and some of the things we were using as tools, and they had matured, gotten easier and simpler. And so that all was part of the rationale behind let's do another book. And we didn't want to do just a sequel to the first one. And I tell you the truth, Nancy, one of the things that was driving me crazy was the vitriol I was seeing in the news. And I thought to myself, you of all people have to be the leaders that are role modeling what it means to have a leadership conversation. And I thought back, my dad was a World War II Marine in the aviator division, tail gunner. And there's an 85% mortality. By the grace of God, he came home and we're here, right? But he was a man who enjoyed discourse. He loved it. So we had people at our house, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. It was phenomenal. And always a civil discourse. And my father was a big believer in civil discourse. And God rest his soul, he used to say, Rose, if you have to shout and you have to shut someone down, you can't hold up your side of the argument. Period, the end. And I'll never forgot it, Nancy. I never forgot it. I thought to myself, it's so true. It's so true. And to this day, I think of my dad and those little pearls of wisdom. My mother had them too. People are different. And the good news about them being different, my mother said, is you get to learn. You get to explore. You can't be all the same and be happy because, and my dad used to say, if everything is identical and you only hang with your own tribe and that gets cult-like.
And boring.
And you lose your opportunity to really diversify. And of course, they were children of immigrants, so they wanted the diversity. I started seeing this stuff and it was really driving me crazy. And I thought, a lot of shouting, a lot of put downs, a lot of graphic conversations. And I thought, no, this is not working. So I thought business is going to be the last value-added space where people can have civil discourse. And we need to return to it. So that was another big reason that I wrote the book. How do you have a conversation? Not dueling monologues. There's a difference between a conversation and a dueling monologue.
Okay, I'm saving that one because you are so right.
Oh my God, it was driving me crazy, and I didn't want that. So I really got to a place where I said, and I have this wonderful woman that works for me, Jill Vanderputten, works for our company, and she says all the time, listening is not waiting for your time to talk. And that's an old one, but it's true. So the art of conversation, the art of correspondence, the way you write an email, the way you write a text, or shoot something off to someone, you really have to be intentional.
Two thoughts. First of all, I know she won't be listening, so I'm safe to say this, but I have a client who often calls the office, and it doesn't matter who answers the phone. She always says, "Who's this?" And then demands to speak to whomever. And I had to actually have a conversation with her yesterday because she was very disrespectful to one of my employees. And she could not understand where I was coming from. I said, our intention is to help you, but we can't help you if you won't listen. Because we need to explain and then take your feedback and then we'll help you. I mean, our whole intention is to solve your problem. And that adversarial type of conversation gets nowhere. And I'm really curious, Rose, why do you think, we'll just use Americans since we happen to be in the United States at the moment, why do you think Americans in general have lost the ability to have a respectful conversation, a civil discourse? Because we don't have to agree with each other. You just have to be respectful and listen to the other person's point of view, because it is going to inform your entire worldview, whether you agree with it or not.
Right. I think whether we like it or not, to be honest with you, and I'm going to say this out loud, it's what we're exposed to. Think of
Yeah.
what our children, I think of my children watching news, sports, anything. Everything's controversial. Everything is being put out there in a disrespectful way. We disrespect the office of the president. My father used to say, it doesn't matter who's in that
It does
office.
not.
We are meant to be respectful of the office. It's bigger than the man. It's bigger than the woman. It's bigger. We just don't do it. So we have lost what I call common courtesy. Um, I think we're shocked when someone is courteous. I was on a plane and this poor person guy was trying to get his luggage up there and he was nervous because he was taking too long. I said, take your time. Don't worry. I'm okay. And he said, oh my God. What? He goes, you just shocked me. And that little bit of common courtesy, that little bit of patience, for God's sakes, plane's not going to take off without you. You don't need to get to your seat immediately. But this is the way people think and the way they act. And in the very beginning of the pandemic, I thought one of the positive outcomes was people had no choice but to take a breath, step back, and reflect. And it did a lot of good. I mean, there were things before this whole unfortunate situation with George Floyd turned the pendulum around. It was starting to become a different society. I was looking even, at Venice when those blue waters were being shown. And they decided that they weren't going to let the cruise ships in anymore because they loved what they saw. Dolphins were returning to the water. It was just nature's way of doing a universal correction that forced people out of their self-centered, only me kind of thinking, to watching people sing through apartment windows in Italy, to around the world. There was no choice. And there was something really positive about that, Nancy. And I believed that the hand of God came down and said, we're taking a timeout. This is a massive timeout. We've all gotten really carried away and we need to think differently. And for a while, I started to feel like we all did in the beginning, I'm going to be knocked out for 2 weeks, back to work. Didn't happen. 2 years later. But in the beginning, we were all a little bit anxious and nervous. And then all of a sudden, you saw men and women that were on the road full time for their jobs, having dinner with their families because there was no place to go. I think that was a huge pivot. And it brought back that certain level of empathy that we hadn't had in a very long time. Unfortunately, it was overshadowed by a lot of the unfortunate incidents that happened following that. And we've had a massive transformation in the workplace, in the way in which people will work and won't work. A lot's going on right now. But I do believe we have to be headed for better ways of interacting, because this is not working. We've got this war in Israel. We've got this thing in the Ukraine. I thought Jamie Dimon at the Economic Forum just killed it. He was spectacular. I sent him an email. He was kind enough to write back at 7 a.m. the next morning. And, we have not met personally. I saw that as glimmers of hope that maybe business leaders would start to turn the pendulum.
I think your point is so spot on. It has to start with leadership. It has to start with world leaders, political leaders, business leaders, and leadership in general has to act better. They have to act better. They have to relearn how to have a conversation and then incorporate that per, what you teach through storytelling to bring others into the story and help them see how they're a part of it. Because we have created this me or you type of culture. It's Democrat or Republican, boss or worker. There's you're remote or you're in person, and everybody is just like this because they're so invested in their position instead of seeing how they can come together for the mutual good. And so I think that does start with the conversations and the storytelling.
Yeah. And people relate to stories. I've told a few of them right here in this conversation. You have too, about this woman that called in and what you did. People relate to that. It's very difficult to relate to information. Information, I'm informing someone. I'm not sharing an insight. I'm not making myself vulnerable. I'm not being evocative. When you're telling a story, you're putting something out there that's relatable. And people can look at it and say themselves in that story, or say, I'd like to see myself in that story, or not. It's all of that. And it makes a huge difference in the eyes of the listener. Plus, it's interactive. A story is interactive. And it's the beginning of the conversation. It's the beginning of the conversation. So I think great leaders are really good storytellers. You look at Zelensky, what he was up against. He didn't get his fame until he entered into a situation that was overwhelming. Okay. As a leader, he did something very different than the guy in Iran who ran. And he said, no, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition, and I'm here to protect my country. And he's standing his ground. And when Jamie Dimon said, it's our responsibility to protect democracies. Listen, no one wants to see anyone killed, or I feel bad for Russian soldiers that got thrown into this because they didn't mean to be there. One boy wrote his mother and said, I don't know why I'm fighting my brothers and sisters. How sad is that, Nancy? But, they're pushed by a bully who's not a leader, who's an absolute bully, to go and aggressively attack a perfectly good country for no reason other than personal self-gain. And I sit there, and whether you like it or not, here's Zelensky. He may not be perfect. Leadership is messy. But here he is, protecting his country, and it's all this time later. And there's democracies. We don't want to see children killed in Palestine. No one wants to see that. At the same time, Israel has a right to be a state, has a right to be a country, and they were attacked. And you've got terrorists making decisions, and you're sitting there. It's very difficult. We have got to find ways to have conversations about these things, and we've got to weigh in a way that gets people to want to participate in a very healthy way. And we're not seeing that. And it's upsetting. It's very upsetting.
You made a comment that I think stood out to me, and that was about, we were talking about a Russian leader who was a bully. I think we have a bullying problem in leadership in our country as well.
Oh my God. And even that woman, she's being a bully.
Well, yeah, it was just unnecessary.
Who is this? I'll tell you a funny story, and you can scrape it if I know we're live. But many, many, many years ago, I was working at Xerox, and I had just started on a fast track. This is when that we were $1,000 a share. And my dearest friend, who was here for a very big milestone birthday this weekend, was young. We were in our 20s. And this guy calls in. He's really angry. So they finally get him to my friend. She answers the phone, and he says, I do not want to speak to another, drops the F-bomb, ING woman, another effing woman. So instead of her getting defensive and crazy, she says to him, well, I'm not doing that now, and I would very much like to help you. And he didn't know what to say. In the moment, it was, and then he burst out laughing, and he said, I'm sorry. And then she said, tell me what's going on, and tell me how I can help. And there's the unmet need again, right? And the guy unloaded, and he'd been through a lot of unfortunate nonsense. Machine wasn't working, couldn't get service, couldn't, and she fixed his problem. At the end of the day, we have to figure out how to do more of that. That was 40 some odd years ago, 45 years ago. I'll be 75 in April. 3/4 of a century later, I still try to apply that thinking when I'm seeing someone that's very disgruntled. When someone gets very upset and starts to carry on, I go, tell me what's wrong. What do you need? It's an unmet need.
It's always an unmet need.
It is always an unmet need. What do you need? And that stops, they're like, well, and if they can voice it, then you can start to work through whatever it is. But that's the leader's job. That's the leader's job. When someone comes in, and whether they're on a, remote technology or they're physically with you and they're throwing up over something, you need to ask, what do you need?
Yeah. Okay. Out of respect for your time and the audience's time, I need to move on. But before I get to my 5 burning questions, this was one of my favorite questions, and I was dying to ask you. Your tagline on your website says, "Roses are fragile. I'm a dandelion," which I loved, made me laugh out loud. But how'd you come up with that?
It's the signature story in the chocolate conversation.
Okay.
It is the signature story in the chocolate conversation. And it would take a little time to share it with you. So I want to respect your time.
Well, I will read it, and we might have a follow-up conversation to this. Christina, I know you dropped the link to the first book in the comments. Would you drop the link to the second book as well, so that I can share that with our viewers? That would be great.
And the story exists in both books. So it's a conversation between my dad and I. And roses are fragile. In your heart, you need to be a dandelion. And you can read the signature story in the book.
I will. I loved that. That was the one thing that just absolutely jumped out off of your website to me. I'm like, okay, I would choose her just because of that line, because to me, that really speaks. I am only a tiny bit younger than you are, but I have come up through the world of hard knocks in business as a young female. And you had to really, you really had to have a stiff spine, and you had to be willing to put up with a lot if you wanted to move forward.
Yes, you did.
So I very much can relate to that. But like I said, we're going to close it out with my 5 burning questions. And I haven't got to ask this question in such a long time. I'm excited to. What is your absolute favorite food in the world, and can you cook it?
My favorite food in the world is eggplant. In any way I can have it. Rolantine. I actually like eggplant Parmesan without the Parmesan. I just love the taste of eggplant. I like it in Chinese food and Italian food. As a vegetable, I love it.
I will tell you, they're the first person that's answered the question that way. So I always love it when I get a unique answer, and I do love that. So what's the one character trait you most admire in other people, and why?
I think courage. Courage to actually say what you mean, not what others want to hear.
And if I were to flip the mirror on you and say, what's the character trait in yourself you're most proud of, and why, what would that be?
Probably that. I have the courage to stand for what I know is right.
I love that. So we've talked a lot about conversations. We've talked a lot about civil discourse. A term you use on your website and in your books is artful conversation. So if somebody doesn't really know what that means and they'd like to try, what would be a simple, artful conversation somebody could start with?
I think what we talked about here is to listen first. Any conversation that starts with a question goes better than one that starts with a declaration. So listen first. Build on what other people are saying. Build on the last thing they've said, whether you agree with it or not, build on it. Don't have the dueling monologue.
Amen. What is your secret talent or something people would be surprised to learn about you?
So what they might be surprised to learn about me is that most of the people I hang out with are very artsy. I love music, in particular blues and jazz, in particular older blues and jazz. And I do enjoy singing. And when I sing, I feel very, energized. Um, but I think from a business talent is I probably can read a room better than most people. I have a unique ability to remember everything somebody says to me and be able to bring it back at a later time. And they're kind of surprised that I listened so deeply and I remember that particular story or whatever they were sharing because I really definitely care.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, last question is, who is one person, they could be famous, not famous, dead or alive, that you would most like to sit down and have a conversation with?
And I'm going to give you two.
That's fine.
Not famous is my paternal grandmother. She died when my father was 10. I was named after her. And he always told me that I reminded him so much of her, and I was named Rose. She was very courageous, and I would love to sit down and just get to know her. I adored my dad, and I'm pretty sure I would have really loved her. Um, and that's somebody I just didn't get an opportunity to meet. And the other one is Joan of Arc.
Oh, great answer. Because of her courage?
Her courage and the fact that the leader at that time wasn't even appreciative, and yet she did it for France, in her mind. And I'm just so taken by her.
That's amazing. Well, this has been a fantastic inaugural episode for 2024. I'm so happy you joined us. For any of you listening, there are plenty of links in the comments to Rose's books. There's also a link to a couple of articles on her website. Please check it out. I think it's something that we need more of in today's society, is more respectful conversations. And if you're not sure where to start, let's start here. So thank you again so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it, Nancy.
Oh,
Thank
it's
you.
wonderful. Thank you all, and I will see you in 2 weeks.